Most of the time, I find that my image cleanup work involves removing blemishes from an image and removing them altogether. I don't want to see that blemish at all. But in some situations, you actually might want to simply tone down an area of the image rather than removing it completely. In those cases, we can remove a blemish, but then tone down the effect of that removal. Let me show you an example here. I like the reflections on the water, especially in the foreground here. I like the rippled sand, but the area in the middle here to me seems a little bit too bright, especially compared to that background area and even the foreground area. It just feels like it's drawing the eye a little bit too much. I like the texture in the foreground, so I don't mind your eye being drawn there, and I certainly don't mind your eye being drawn up into the sky with the sun and the beautiful color in the sky. But this area I just feel is a little bit too distracting. So I'm going to remove that area, but then I'll tone things down so that I'm just reducing the strength of the brightness there. I'll get started by adding a new image layer. I'll go ahead and just call this Cleanup. And then I can choose any technique I'd like to clean up that area on this cleanup layer. I'm just simply going to use the Spot Healing Brush tool with the Content Aware option, making sure that the Sample All Layers option is turned on. And then I'll click and drag across that area, and that looks to be a reasonably good cleanup. I'll click and drag in a couple other areas here. Now, bear in mind, I'm currently cleaning up that area in its entirety, and so I need to keep in mind that ultimately I just want to tone down that area, so I probably don't need to clean it up completely. But at the moment, you can see that the reflections are, for all intents and purposes, completely removed from the image in that area. But to allow them to show through just a little bit, I can reduce the opacity of my cleanup layer. It's important to keep in mind that we don't want to use the same cleanup layer for areas of the image that we want to completely clean up, as well as areas that we only want to partially clean up. And so you might even create a separate cleanup layer for each area of the image where you'd like to tone something down. For example, I might create separate cleanup layers for this midground area and the more distant area if I wanted to tone down both of them. That way I can adjust the overall intensity of the cleanup effect individually for each of those areas. To actually tone down the cleanup so that I can see some of the reflections there, I can simply reduce the opacity for the cleanup layer. So with the cleanup layer active on the Layers panel, I'll point to the word opacity at the top of the Layers panel, and I can simply click and drag to the left to use that scrubby slider feature in order to tone down the opacity for my cleanup layer. If I reduce the opacity to 0%, then you'll see the cleanup has no effect whatsoever. If I increase it to 100%, you'll see that the reflections disappear altogether. So I can fine-tune depending on how much I want to be able to see that portion of the image. And I think right about there looks like it blends in a little bit better. So I'm using an opacity, in this case, of 31%. I'll turn off my cleanup layer and turn it back on again, and you can see that I'm just toning down the intensity of those reflections. So I've completely removed a blemish, so to speak, from the image, but then reduced the opacity of my cleanup layer so that that blemish, in this case just the reflections, are merely toned down. They're not removed altogether.